Hello. Today we have Class 8, Sectarian Religion and Episcopal Authority, which sounds more complicated than saying early theological and ecclesiological arguments, almost all of them in Rome, which is what it's really about. I've sent you, along with the announcement for the class, a short list of books on the early church in Rome. One thing to notice about it is that almost all of them are extremely recent, which tells you that there's a lot of important work being done on the early church in Rome. I could, of course, if I wanted to, I could, of course, have sent you about Rome, a bibliography of 2,000 pages. Most of it would have been in Italian, but doesn't do me any good. I can't read Italian, which is one reason why I didn't send you all that stuff. There's a lot of it, of course, in Latin, but since knowledge keeps increasing dramatically about the early church in Rome, the older stuff is mostly not very useful anymore, because what's still believed to be accurate in it is included in the new stuff, and the new stuff corrects the old. So there's no need, if you're not going to write something specialized in which you critique the scholarship, there's no need to go back and read the old stuff. Just as a quick note, the project that I myself am now working on relates to the survival of the Novatianist church in the early period. So I'm aware of what people are doing as far as that goes. The reason why I included these 2 volumes on Papandreou about Novatian is not because of that, but rather because Novatian was the earliest surviving theological writer who writes in Rome. He's the first Latin Roman theologian, and that's worth knowing. I think actually, before I send you this list, I will include on it the more important works from the church in Rome that survive. There's no reason, give you you shouldn't only be reminded of the secondary stuff. The primary stuff, like the first epistle of Clement and the Shepherd of Hermas, should be on your list too. So I will make a note to do that. Anyway, so what do we have this time? We have a grab bag of things. Many of these are it is a truism. In other words, it is something which is true, but it's sort of a saying people like to make, that Christian theology develops through controversy, and I think that's true. The church only seems to define its beliefs and develop them more explicitly when it is arguing against something it thinks is incorrect. Because of that, most early Christian theology is reactive rather than proactive. People don't sit down and write books on the Trinity just for something to do. They sit down and write books on the Trinity because someone else is teaching something about the Trinity that they think is inappropriate. So usually these things develop in argumentation. Because the church in Rome was in a place where education was developed at a high level, because the city of Rome was immeasurably larger than any other ancient city, because Greek was such an important language in the church in Rome, and Greek was the language of culture in the ancient world. Even in Rome, Greek was the language of culture. For all of these reasons, there is quite a bit that survives from the early church in Rome. We do not know whether or not the things that we're going to look at today, many of which are really based in Rome, were matched in other parts of the ancient world because we do not have the materials to study. It is a fact that many of the materials we have to study about very basic Christian practices and beliefs come from the city of Rome. That is not necessarily any indication of the fact that the city of Rome was actually where these things were worked out or where these things arose, but rather just where we have information. Just to take an example of the group that I'm studying, the Novatianists are called Novatianists, though they arose everywhere in the Roman Christian world at the same time as a result of the persecution under Decius in the 250s. They're called Novatianists because Novatian, the first Latin language Christian author in Rome, became the leader of their breakaway group in Rome. So because Rome was the place that most people noticed, they came to be called by that name, though we have no reason to think that they were more prevalent there or more important there than they were anywhere else. They certainly survived elsewhere for much longer. So the first thing to notice is that we should not assume that because we are looking at Rome, that Rome is the natural, that if we had all the information we would like, that Rome is where we would imaginatively locate these things, right? If people in every state in the United States have tremendous arguments about the postal system, to take something that nobody argues about that I'm not aware of, right? And 2,000 years from now, all of our information about the great postal riots of the 2020s comes from the state of Missouri, then of course everyone will talk about the great postal riots in Missouri in the 2020s because that's what they know about. Even if they're aware of the fact that they're happening elsewhere, they'll always talk about the great postal riots in Missouri because that's what they have to show their students, and that's what they can write books about, and that's what they can have TV miniseries about. 500 years ago, the great postal riots, wasn't it terrible? We need to guard against over-particularizing what we're doing. What we're trying to look at is what's going on in the church and how it works. And we're going to locate it when we can. To begin with, here in pages 74 and 75, all of you will, I hope, at some point read Eusebius's History of the Early Church, the first surviving book called Ecclesiastical History. One of the interesting things about it is that he includes in his history quite a number of letters written from one church to another, or parts of letters, and quite a number of letters written from one bishop to another. One of the things this indicates to us is that Eusebius thought that this kind of church-to-church communication was an important part of Christian life. It seems to have gone on from a very early period. St. Paul, of course, writes letters from one church to another, as do John, James, and Peter. So we have 4 people doing this just in the New Testament, and if all of the letters that are credited to Paul or John or Peter are not really by him, then we have more people than that doing it. But anyway, it's quite a standard thing for Christians to do. Okay. It does seem, as we see here, that this first section, Dionysius of Corinth, Serapion, and Demetrius, it does seem to be true that locally, considered sort of on a province-wide basis, bishops of smaller places tended to write bishops of larger places for advice. And bishops of larger places seemed to think that it was their prerogative to write to smaller places and give them advice on what to do. Whether this was from some specifically Christian idea or whether this was because that's what happened in the Roman secular world and they were just mirroring it, we do not know. But it does seem, it is important to understand that the organization of the church seems from a very early period to have mirrored the organization of the empire. right? Diocese, which for us is a church term and nothing else, is actually a political term from the late empire for a group of provinces, right? Diocese is not a specifically Christian term, just like bishop, episcopos, is not a specifically Christian term, and deacon is not a specifically Christian term, and even presbyter, priest, is not a specifically Christian term. These are all things that Christians take over from other groups and other uses. Okay. Now, let me tell you a few things about the church in Rome in order for you to understand what's going on here. If you read this list and 50 other books, you will see that they all add up to what I'm about to tell you. One of the things we know about the early church in Rome is that from a very early period it was multilingual and divided up for worship's sake, at least primarily among language groups. The original Christians in Rome, as in so many other places, seem to have been Jewish. And there were, as far as we can tell, Eastern language Jewish groups like Aramaic-speaking Jewish groups, as well as Greek-speaking Jewish groups in Rome. And those groups, just like the Jews in Jerusalem in the book of Acts, right? The Hellenists and the Hebrews met separately because they spoke different languages in worship, and the same thing happened with Christian groups in Rome. There were also there developed pagan-based Christian congregations of different language backgrounds, and there seem also to have been different ethnic backgrounds. For example, Marcion seems to have belonged for at least part of his time in Rome to a sort of Asian-based congregation before he gave his big splash of money to the church in general. The church in Rome was Lamp. The name you actually say Lampe. It's a German name. This book is original in German. Peter Lamp's book, From Paul to Valentinus, is very good on pulling together what is known and trying to make sense of it. And he argues very strongly that there were congregations in different parts of Rome that functioned at least semi-independently. It is very interesting now looking at the papacy to realize that Rome was one of the very last churches we know about to develop a kind of central structure whereby there was one figure who was actually in charge of the church. For a very long time, these different ethnic and language-based churches seem to have functioned pretty much independently in practical terms, even to the level of having their own burial grounds outside the city that were kept separately for them. If you go to Rome and look at the catacombs, there are catacombs in every direction, Christian catacombs, and also pagan ones and Jewish ones, but Christian catacombs in every direction outside of the city. And Lampe has done a good job showing that these seem to go with the particular congregations that were based in that part of the city closest to where the catacomb was. And so the inscriptions in those different catacombs tend to be of particular kinds, Latin or Greek or Jewish or pagan or all these different things. You can trace that pretty well. So that's an important thing to know. One of the things this means, of course, is that when we look at things like the Quartodeciman controversy over the dating of Easter, it's much easier to understand, first of all, how a situation where different Christian groups in the same city celebrated Easter on different days could have gone on for generations without bothering anybody, right? The first reason is that the different groups who did things differently tended to be from particular places, and so they worshiped together. So the people who wanted to do it on the 14th of Nisan, the Quartodecimans, right, the 14ers, they would be a particular language group from a particular place, and they were all getting together for worship anyway, so they would have their own calendar and they would celebrate Easter on a particular day, and the other people wouldn't be all that aware of it because they were a considerable distance away in the city, operating in a separate language in a separate location, and they had their own practice, and they would be over there and it wouldn't bother them. What seems to have caused a controversy is when the locally based people who are celebrating Easter always on Sunday become aware of the growing attractiveness and the growing numbers of people who are doing it in a way different from them, and then they respond with hostility and want to say, no, 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 we do it the right way, we do it the original way, so you're required to do it the way we do because we should all worship together in one way. That sounds very good to us. It's very important to remember when we get to the Quartodecimans that at that time the church in Rome is not worshiping together as a unified group. As far as we know, it never had in history. It had always been divided. And there's no possibility that they're going to worship together as a unified group. First of all, they all speak and pray in different languages, so it's not practically possible. Second of all, there is no place in Rome that's large enough for them to meet together. Third of all, if they did find a place that was large enough for and all meet together, they would instantly be arrested because what they're doing is illegal. And one of the ways they avoid getting noticed too much and arrested is by splitting up into smaller groups and meeting in their own local neighborhoods where everybody knows what's going on and it doesn't bother people too much, right? So it's very important to understand how these things work. The Roman Church under Victor, here he's trying to give you a sense of how this works, and Victor is trying to Victor is trying to organize things so that everybody's doing things the way Victor thinks they ought to do. It's perfectly clear from the response that Victor gets that other people in Rome don't think that being the titular head of the churches in Rome means that he's in charge of them in any detailed fashion. One of the most attractive suggestions that I have read made in modern scholarship is that for a very long time the leader of the church in Rome, and this is not just Rome, there seem to have been other places that worked this way, for example Alexandria, which was multilingual, multi-ethnic too, and Antioch certainly. Being the bishop in a place like that for a long time would mean that you were the person, a British scholar called it being the corresponding secretary, you were the person who represented the church to the outside world, so that you would write the letters for the church to another place. And so, of course, that you would sort of speak for the church, but that does not mean that you were functioning internally in the way that we imagine bishops to function now, or in the way that they may well have been functioning in smaller places where everybody got together in one congregation, which we've already talked about. That, as far as we can tell, most places worked with single congregations for a very long time because their Christian churches in most places were small. Okay, Hippolytus, just quickly here. Hippolytus is a tremendously important early Christian author. Quite a lot of his stuff survives and is translated in the Ante-Nicene Christian Library. Hippolytus writes in Greek. There's been a lot of recent work done on Hippolytus. It seems now that the weight of scholarship is arguing that Hippolytus is not only part of this sort of Eastern bloc, Greek-speaking bloc in the church in Rome, but that there are good reasons to think that Hippolytus was actually raised in the East and came as an adult to Rome, the same way that Irenaeus did to Gaul. That would not be in the slightest bit surprising. Certainly Hippolytus writes enough stuff while he's in Rome so that we know that he lived there for a very long time. But he seems to have come as an adult to Rome, which of course makes figuring out the church in Rome even more difficult, because that means that when you read Hippolytus, not only are you not necessarily reading someone whose ideas reflect the majority of people in Rome, but it's also possible that his ideas wouldn't reflect the ideas of anyone in Rome except Hippolytus. They might have been ideas that he brought with him from Asia that never sunk in Rome, but Hippolytus, like, a good Eastern person, knows what he thinks is right and he's going to push it no matter what. One of the things the Quartodeciman controversy shows you is that people in the East had very set ideas about what apostolic meant, and people in Rome, Latin people in Rome, had very set ideas about what apostolic meant, and weren't always the same, right? So Hippolytus's idea of traditional Christian practice may not have actually been representative of what people did in Rome. This is important to remember because, as Hall mentions, Hippolytus includes in one of his writings the earliest pretty full Eucharistic prayer that we have that survives, which is always spoken of and thought of as the original Roman rite. And the truth is, Hippolytus is very clear in saying that this is the prayer that they use in his congregation. But as I said, his congregation may have been a group of people who were mostly or all from the East, came to Rome to work, and so his rite, Roman rite, may not actually have been Roman at all. It may have been considered very weird, even for local Romans who were worshiping in Greek. We just don't know. So if you're having an honest academic discussion with someone and they say, what is the ancient, what is the rite which was produced in Rome? The truth is, Hippolytus's Greek language rite and the later rite, that the Latin rite that comes in later, which seems to be from Spain, as I said before, it's perfectly possible that neither of these things is actually from Rome. And it's perfectly possible that we have no record of an actual native Roman Eucharistic rite at all. We do have two ancient rites, one complete and one, the Eucharistic prayer, that were used in Rome. But of course, I went with Father Dart one time with a couple of my children up to Yosemite, and we did a mass, on a rock in Yosemite out of the 28 prayer book. And so, if we'd left the 28 prayer book there and someone found it in 2,000 years, would they be justified in saying this is the traditional rite of the California hills? No, not any more than anything else. So, you need to think a little bit about what the information that we have actually means and what it actually tells us. Hippolytus is a very interesting study. He is philosophical in his thinking, though not enough to make you think he's sort of professionally trained at a high level, but he's certainly an intelligent, well-read man. He's also a little bit of a hardliner, which of course makes him attractive to people like us who think that sin is a real thing. One of the great arguments, here's an interesting problem. One of the great arguments we know about from the early church and disciplinary matters is between Bishop Callistus of Rome and Hippolytus, who completely disapproves of him. We only hear about this from Hippolytus's side. That's why I gave you a little article, a lecture by Prestige, about Callistus, trying to figure out what Callistus is really up to, because it's very important to understand that Callistus looks very bad in the materials that we have about him, but the materials we have about him are all being written by Hippolytus to demonstrate that he's very bad. So exactly how far we should take those as telling us true facts is impossible to say. Impossible to say. We don't have any check on any of this stuff. So we have to be honest and say, it's very, Callistus looks really bad. And, as a non-Roman Catholic, if Callistus really was the way Hippolytus depicts him, then the Roman Catholic Church, if they're going to say Callistus is a pope and popes are, always need to be defended to the last ditch, then Roman theologians have a lot of work to do. But we can't really say that much, unfortunately. Okay. No, here we hear a little bit about novation here at the end. There is a volume, just quickly, there is a volume of Novation's writings. Maybe I'll put that in too. in the Fathers of the Church. All of his stuff is translated there. There's actually a new translation of his stuff which just came out last year, which is much more expensive. I can put that in there too in case you're looking to spend a lot of money. Let's look at, I've spent the last 5 years in all the free time I've had working on the Novatianists, and so I spent a lot of that time working on the early church in Rome. I am well aware of the fact that what I just said to you over the last 15 minutes sounds like not very much information. The truth is, it requires a huge amount of archaeology and reading of what survives and trying to piece it together and make sense of it just to end up with that much. It's everybody who writes a book has to have a theory about everything, but it doesn't do any good to tell you a whole bunch, to tell you 6 different theories and then say, pick, because there's no way to pick. What we need to do is to see what the information actually provides for us and try to make sense of things when we look at them on that basis. Careful study of the early church, as we said at the very beginning, sometimes means adding up what you know, assessing it, and trying to tell yourself both what you know and what you don't know and what you can't know, given the state of our present knowledge. For the early church in Rome, we don't know, and this is the pre-Nicene church in Rome, we don't know almost everything we'd really like. All the questions we'd like to know, we really don't have answers to. That's just one of the things we have to live with. Just as a quick note, if you read Eusebius's church history, he has actually quite a lot of stuff about Rome. It's very interesting and very important. One of the things he does is he gives a count up of the clergy at different ranks in the 240s in Rome. So he says X number of priests, X number of deacons, X number of subdeacons, X number of readers, X number of doorkeepers, X number of exorcists, X number of widows and orphans supported by the church. You can imagine how church historians grab on this statistics, right? Grab on this, I do too, because they're essentially the only statistics we have from the church, maybe before the Reformation, that we have from the church almost anywhere. That the problem is we have absolutely no idea how accurate they are and no way to check. And since we don't know anybody else's statistics, even if they're all completely accurate and we knew that they were all completely accurate, which we don't, that wouldn't tell us nearly as much as we would like it to, because we don't know anyone else's statistics, right? If we had all the stats for the church in Corinth, and all the stats for the church in Antioch, and all the stats for the church in Alexandria, and all the stats for the church in Carthage, and all the stats for the church in Rome, because we know enough about those places, we could do some kind of comparison with size of the city and all that kind of stuff. We just don't know anything. So, numbers in a void are in some ways worse than no numbers in a void, because they can give you an idea that you've got all this knowledge and now I can, run with it. But we don't know where to run or how far to go. Okay, let's say a little bit about these different things. Now we're on 120, the Quartodeciman controversy. The Quartodeciman controversy is this in a nutshell. Christian groups that were formed in a Jewish background, when it came time to celebrate the anniversary of the death and resurrection of Christ, celebrated the anniversary of the death and resurrection of Christ with him rising, with him being crucified the morning of the, of the first day of the Pascha, the Passover, and the rising on the third day, right? So they keyed it to the actual Passover, which is a movable feast. It's not fixed on any day of the week. Christians who were not in a Jewish milieu, and so first of all didn't have that going on all around them, the Passover like right in their faces, and also who were used to celebrating the Eucharist, Christian festivals, on a particular day of the week, Sunday, wanted to celebrate Easter on Sunday because it was a big Christian festival, so they wanted it on the Christian festival day, which is Sunday, first day of the week. Just as a note, the classical Roman calendar, Latin calendar from central Italy, was a solar calendar, and each month had 3 weeks of 10 days each. That's where we get our 30-day month from, right? So with a calendar it's a solar calendar, not a lunar calendar like the Jews, and it has 10-day weeks, not 7-day weeks like the Jews, you can see how you can't, for too long, go along with a calendar like that, because it never helps you know when Sunday is, right? Because it doesn't fit. What we actually have now, we ourselves in the U.S., we have Jewish days, and weeks of 7, so we count Sundays, but we have the old Roman months, which is why our weeks don't fit the months. Their weeks didn't exactly fit the months either, but they were closer than we are. You can see that in itself right there tells you the lure of Sunday. People want to know when Sundays come because that's very important. The argument, the Quartodeciman controversy, is an argument between Christians from parts of the world that were Semitic enough so they were influenced by Jewish presence to always key their Easter anniversary to actual Passover, versus people who were living in a pagan enough world, not completely pagan because they're still thinking in 7-day weeks, right? But pagan enough so they wanted to have it come on Sunday no matter what. And both of these people argue that their practice is apostolic. It's certainly possible that by the time the last disciples died, that there were that there were Christians following both practices, and the apostles knew about it and thought it was okay. It's possible that both are apostolic. It's absolutely certain, I think, though we have no information, but it's absolutely certain, I think, that the original way would have been the Quartodeciman way, keying on Passover, because for the original group of Christians based in Jerusalem working with the Jewish calendar, they didn't even have, they didn't have any exposure to people outside that world. So another way of having an anniversary of Passover other than on Passover would not have occurred to them. It's hard to imagine how that could have occurred to them. The Quartodecimans lose this argument because by the time the argument happens, the great majority of the church is no longer Jewish Christian, they're pagan Christian, and they just don't buy into the Passover thing. They want to have their festivals on a festival day. Hail thee, festival day, blessed day that art hallowed forever, right? They want that Sunday. They don't want Thursday or Friday or Tuesday. It's a pure, here, look on page 156. There are a couple of things I wanted to point out. First of all, here, on page 154, 3 lines up from number 2 on the left-hand side there, preserving as they did by an apostolic tradition the custom which has prevailed to this day, that it was not proper to end the fast on any other day than on the day of the resurrection of our Savior. Eusebius thinks it's apostolic to have it on Sunday. Of course he does, as a pagan Christian. Who knows? I certainly don't. Enough about that. We're not going to solve the problem now. I have no good erasers. That's a practical problem. Okay, if you look on the next page, 156, right by number 12, for not only is there a controversy about the day, this is Irenaeus, but also about the very manner of the fast. For some think they ought to fast a single day, but others two, and others again even more. And in the opinion of others, the day amounts to 40 continuous hours. I wanted to point that out to you to remind you of the fact that very early that Lent takes quite a while to develop into a 40-day feast. And as a matter of fact, is not really a 40-day feast for very many groups. For us, of course, with our pre-Lent, Lent is actually longer than that. There are groups, Christian groups, who have a 60-day Lent. I believe the Ethiopians, who always do more than everyone else and everything, have an 80-day Lent. If you really want to be hardcore in your Christian practice, you have to become an Ethiopian Orthodox, because they're the ones who do more of everything than anybody else. Irenaeus is making it perfectly clear that he knew at least 3 different ways of fasting for, before the arrival of Easter. One is 1 day, one is 2 days, one is 40 hours, which would take you from, a kind of midday, Good Friday service all the way through till your Easter observance, and that quite quickly becomes at least a very widespread standard. It's very important to see that there is variety here, but Irenaeus is not suggesting that this means that church unity is impaired. As a matter of fact, he's trying to argue that that's a good thing. Okay. Now, let's say a few things here theologically. For Christians, there are 2 basic theological problems. One is, versus the Jews and with the Old Testament in mind, how can you say that Jesus is the Son of God incarnate and not be polytheists? Right? The second is against the pagans. If you're saying that God the Father is God and Jesus is God the Son born as a human being, even before you get to the Holy Ghost question, right? Don't you have 2 gods, and so why aren't you worshiping all of our gods too? Since you're already polytheists, why not really be polytheistic and worship all these other gods? You've already got multiple. Jews were easier to understand for pagans than Christians were. So the intellectual problems that Christians entertain very early on are related to this. How can we take the whole Bible seriously, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, and still say that Jesus Christ is the Son of God? There are a number of obvious ways of trying to make these things fit, right? Dynamic monarchianism, to explain, is an idea that the power of God, dunamis, same word that we call dynamite, right? Alfred Nobel uses the word, the Greek word dunamis for his mighty explosive. The power of God would, when Jesus is born as a human being, the power of God enters into him and makes him able to do all these things. So it's truly God working in him, but it's God's power. It's not a separate being. It's the power of God the Father present and active in Jesus. So yes, the things Jesus does are divine. Yes, you're seeing God acting when you're watching him in the Gospels. Yes, that's all, and that's all really happening, but it fits with the Old Testament because God is one, because his power is not separate from him. Right? That's dynamic monarchianism, a way of thinking that there's a duality, but it's only an apparent duality, right? So that's why it's called monarchianism. There's one head, one leader. Hippolytus, the banker here in 123 at the bottom of page 162, is has Jesus being a human being, conceived and born of the Holy Spirit and a virgin, but again, enjoying the power of God inside of him. So it's interesting. You can spin dynamic monarchianism either, yes, it's really the power of God present, or yes, he's really a human being with the power of God in him. You can spin it either divine side up, or human side up, depending on what you're talking about, which is another way of seeing why this would be attractive, because the two natures of Christ, the divine nature and human nature, are things that Christians want to talk about, right? So dynamic monarchians would have a way of talking about these things that would make some sense. The treatise against Noetus by Hippolytus, which is a very interesting treatise, survives, and Hippolytus, who in many ways is quite developed, quite mature. His theology is moved quite a long way on its way to being the way we speak. Noetus is one of these who wants to insist on the divinity of God, of the unity of God the Father, and does it not by saying that Jesus is God's power, but by saying that Jesus is the Father himself. So look at this 4 lines down in this 124. He alleged that Christ was the Father himself, and that the Father himself was born, suffered, and died. So the life of Christ in the Gospels, according to Noetus, is sort of a chapter in the life of God when he chooses to become a human being. It's a great insistence on the divinity of Christ, but there's no distinction there's no Father and Son. It's just, you're just saying Son because it's a part of his life when he's born as a human being. And that, of course, isn't going to work in a lot of ways. Think about this in the abstract. What's one of the obvious problems with thinking this way? As many people have objected to that kind of idea ever since, what are we seeing when we see Jesus go apart to pray? If Jesus is really God the Father, right, then when he goes apart to pray, what's he doing? Some people like Noetus have argued, well, praying is a good thing for us, so Jesus is pretending to do it in order to teach us to do it. But then, of course, you have the problem that Jesus would then be teaching through pretense rather than reality. Jesus would not be an actual human being living a good religious life. He's someone who's pretending to do something he's really not doing because he can't do it, because God can't pray. That doesn't make any sense. Okay. I won't take you through the problems of Callistus and how he was financially dishonest and then, sentenced to the mines and rescued by Marcia, the concubine of Commodus. Just as a quick note, Hall makes the point. Theology professors love to say unkind things about, people's concubines. One thing to remember, among others, is that concubinage in the late Roman world was a perfectly legal and respectable relationship. When we get to Augustine, we'll talk about this, because Augustine had a concubine, which he tore himself up about for the whole rest of his life and acted as if he'd been, sort of going to bars and sleeping around with people randomly, whereas actually he was in a relationship that the culture that he was in considered to be a form of marriage. So in other words, he was married and had a kid who lived to be almost 20 years old before he died, a Deodatus. And the way Augustine talks about it, you would never know that. Marcia, who was a Christian woman who was Commodus's concubine, it's not as if she were a Playboy bunny living at the mansion with Hugh. It's not that kind of a relationship. Being the concubine of an upper class Roman man was a legally recognized binding relationship. I'm not arguing that she was, a nice Amish woman, but we don't have that whole category of relationship does not exist for us. It's very difficult to look back on someone like that and understand, and I don't think I do, understand how different a relationship like that, a Christian woman with a non-Christian man, would have been thought of in the church or even by Marcia if she were in a marriage where she was called his wife with a non-Christian man, because both relationships would have been formalized completely outside the church. But we are centuries away from there being any Christian marriage rite. It takes a very long time for marriage to develop. Marriage is really a medieval thing. Inside the church, marriage is really a medieval thing, and so she is 600 years too early to get married in the church. So we can't really look back on her and say, well, she was a loose woman because she wasn't married in the church, because everybody wasn't married in the church at the time that she's alive. It's very easy to be a modern professor and say snippy things about someone like Marcia and feel very, very respectable while she's not. And I think we need to be a little bit more careful than that. I have two daughters who are both in college, and my ideas about how young women should behave themselves and how they should get married are, well, I'm right on the same page with the ecumenical patriarch as far as that concerned. I have my ideas are happily ensconced in the 800s. So I am not arguing in favor of looser morals or do-it-yourself marriage practice. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that that we have to understand that this is a long time ago in a completely different cultural situation, and we cannot talk about someone. It's both uncharitable and inaccurate to make snide suppositions about someone like Marcia's Christian understanding and faith based on the fact that she's the concubine of a pagan man, because that just everything about that situation, and of course also the chief magistrate of the Roman state, so she can hardly bring up her Christianity to him, and say, honey, let's go to church and get married. First of all, the church doesn't do marriages yet. They don't have any marriage ceremonies yet, so she couldn't do that even if she wanted to. But it's hard for me to imagine he didn't know that she was a Christian, and that we know that she was actually able to help other Christians because of her position, because she helps get Callistus out of the mines, as well as a whole bunch of other Christians from Rome. So she's actively functioning outside of the church at some risk to herself, in order to be able to perform charitable acts for other people. And that's what we know. I just think you have to I just think we have to figure all those things in and then realize that there are a lot of different things going on here. Anyway, the history of marriage is a very interesting study, and we don't have time for it now, and we're actually too early for it now. There's no sign of it yet in Christian life. We need to talk about that later. Just as a note, because I used to teach a course on sacraments for 10 years. Christian marriage is a completely different sacrament with a completely different history than other Christian all the Christian sacraments all have quite different histories, but marriage is a real odd duck among the sacraments. I myself am married. I was married in a church. I have a sacramental marriage. I am on my first marriage. And anyway, I just got a husband whom I haven't met, but close enough to, living close enough to us, misbehaved himself recently, and I have heard about that twice at great length from my wife, who is, I always thought she was, but has made it perfectly clear that as far as she's considered, marriage is a lifelong bond, and it has rules, and rules will be respected. So, all of that said, marriage is not a sacrament that goes back to the beginning of Christian living the way Eucharist does, or baptism, or even anointing, and I guess you could say ordination too. Those all go back to the very beginning. Confirmation doesn't really, because it doesn't separate off for a long time. But marriage is a very late comer to the field. Okay, sorry I got distracted, but it's worth knowing. Okay, I like Hall's book a lot. It's really very good, but I was really struck by the uncharitableness of that comment in his book, and I think it's in his book, or is it in one of the notes here? But anyway, I just think we have to be better than that. Oh yes, here it is. It's note number 10 on page 166. Marcia, quote, "Her life in such surroundings could scarcely be in strict accord with gospel precepts," says Duchesne. That's a hard thing to say. I'd like to have talked. Anyway, I've talked about that enough. Okay. The incompetence of Zephyrinus. There's a lot of incompetence going around. There are many, just as a note, there are many records of bishops of Rome saying things that would certainly later be considered heretical. Part of that is the messiness of developing theology and developing Christian understanding. And maybe that's as much as we need to say, but it takes a while before everyone gets on the same page with these things. Hippolytus, again, doesn't care for Zephyrinus either. He doesn't like Callistus. He doesn't like Zephyrinus. I think Hippolytus is a scream. Okay. Hippolytus, or Zephyrinus here, at the bottom of page 167, is making two firm distinctions between the Father and the Son. It's well. Let me. Okay. Let me say something about Sibelius and Modalist Monarchianism. Sibelius here, who was mentioned in selection 127, is a Modalist Monarchian, and his name becomes the name used of Modalists. A dynamic Monarchian, as we said, one God, and his power is in Jesus. So it's really God's power, but Jesus is not another God. He's just a human being with God's power in him. A modalist Monarchian says that mode that God has three modes, and that sometimes God is the Father, and sometimes God, appears, is present and active as the Son. Sometimes God is present and active as the Spirit, but there is only one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. There is only one God who is sometimes active and present as Father, sometimes active and present as Son, sometimes active and present as Spirit. Three modes. So the modes are on the level of appearance and activity, but they are not distinct or separate beings. There is only one. It's a way of trying to have three in one at the same time. This, up to the present day, has many adherents. It's easier to understand than classical Trinitarian theology. I cannot now recall how many modalist sermons on the Trinity I've heard, but it is certainly more than one. In my life have I sat, never in an APCK church yet, but I have sat in many churches and heard people try to explain the Trinity and get it exactly wrong, which is one reason for studying these things, because these different possibilities have been considered. Oh, Jesus was a great guy. He really had the power of God in him. That's certainly true, but he had the power of God in him because he's God the Son incarnate, not because we are dynamic monarchians. If someone says Jesus was a great God, he really had the power of God in him, that's dynamic monarchianism, right? In Jesus, God appeared to us and was active among us as a son, but we know there's really only one God, right? That's modalist monarchianism. I've heard both of those in sermons. Generally speaking, the monarchians are choosing easy, intellectually easier ways of trying to make sense of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit being one God. I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. You can say that very happily as a modalist. It looks very, what you're saying looks very different to you when you say it, but you can say the words very happily. Okay. The last thing, forgiveness of sins. Let me say a little bit about this. As the church grew, it necessarily became more noticeable. As it became more noticeable, it naturally got into more trouble because it was against the law to be a Christian, and the more Christians were noticed, the more likely it was that they would be punished for being Christians. As there began to be breakouts, larger breakouts of persecution, the question of what to do with people who had lapsed in persecution after the persecution had died down, and they might say want to come back to the church, arose more and more centrally, right? It became more and more of a question. This really came to the fore in the first great empire-wide persecution under Decius in the 250s throughout the Roman Empire. We're going to hear about that next time with Cyprian. This is what this forgiveness of sins part is. There was people like Hippolytus and Novatian and others wanted to hold to the traditional practice, saying that if you publicly apostatize, if someone says, "Are you a Christian?" and you say, "What?" then prove that you're not a Christian by doing the sacrifice. Okay, right? And then when everything's died down, they come back and say, "Gee, I'm so sorry, I want to come back." The traditional answer to that was, you have apostatized, you have removed yourself from the church. And God can receive you and you can go to heaven, but you can't belong to the church anymore. On your deathbed, maybe you can be received. And certainly God can usher you into heaven. If you're truly repentant, he can forgive you, but you can't come back and just join in. You've apostatized. You've publicly denounced the faith. That was clearly the traditional practice everywhere that we can see a practice. Callistus, and then soon after him, other people in the empire are going to argue, other bishops in the empire are going to argue that the church needs to have some kind of process by which people could be brought back into the church after grievous sin, after any grievous sin, could be forgiven upon appropriate repentance and making of, reconciliation. This is an argument. The proper bounds of this is something that's been argued about ever since. It's never completely happily been solved. Certainly the practice that we have now in the province, which is that any sin can potentially be forgiven with proper repentance, and that upon forgiveness, upon confession and forgiveness, that the person is then, rejoined to the body as a full member. That is the universal practice of the church. People have different ideas about what's required for proper repentance, but there are no Christian groups anymore that do not deny the universal possibility of forgiveness of sins and reintegration into the body. So these arguments, we're going to talk about it next week with Cyprian, and it goes on for the rest of the antique period. This question of, can people be forgiven and brought back in no matter what, never really goes away. And so this is the first time we've seen it with this reading number 128. And I wanted to point out to you that Hippolytus treats Callistus as a horrifying, putting forward a horrifying new idea. As far as we know, it is a new idea, that anybody can come back. And it is, part of me at least, and part of the church at least, is horrified by this idea. But in the end, Callistus's suggesting that everything is potentially forgivable wins out, and becomes the standard practice. So Hippolytus, like the Quartodecimans, is certainly speaking for the tradition when he speaks, but it's an argument that he is destined to lose. And we will see more about this as time goes forward. I'm sorry that this has been so broken up. We didn't have a chance to look in detail at those writings, but I thought it was more useful to you to have a sort of one step back explanation of what's going on, rather than drowning in some of the details, which I love to do. Perhaps sometime we'll have a chance to do that more. Thank you very much. I will send you an extended list and look forward to seeing you next week for Cyprian.